Good afternoon. My name is Landon Smith. Today I'm going to be briefing you on the potential Iran-Israeli crisis, the conflict going on that could possibly go on there. 2022. This is going to be assuming no U.S. involvement. So we'll kick it off right now. All right. So starting off with METDC, our mission here is the defense of northern Israel against an unchecked military incursion led by Iran and their plight to destroy the nation state of Israel or take back lost Arab territory in the north. Uh, what I'm thinking is that there's going to be a strike in northern Syria, or there's going to be a strike into Syria preemptively by the Israelis, or there's going to be an Iranian incursion into the Golan Heights, is what I'm assuming, or possibly even through Lebanon. Uh, so talking about the enemy, we're looking at Iran primarily, Syria possibly. They're a great proxy, and then also potentially Russia. So probably support elements would be coming from Russia. So think like air support or logistical elements. And then of course you got Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Hezbollah, Hamas, and probably some Syrian armed forces in there too. Um, so yeah, we're going to go on to the next slide. So METTC continued, talking about the terrain. It's going to be fight for the Golan Heights or in western Syria. Golan Heights is pretty much rocky rolling hills at the feet of the Golan Heights, intermixed with fertile plains extending in Syria, the south. We may see conflicts arise in the Gaza Strip as well via Hamas, just to kind of tie up IDF forces even more. Down there, it's going to be a little bit more dry and dusty, right? So talking about the troops, we got some nice militiamen right there from Iran. We're looking at Iranian regulars, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, of course the Iranian Air Force, Syrian armed forces too, and like I said before, we have the potential of seeing Russian Air Force components, whether it be direct action, like fighters or bombers, but probably logistical elements too. So yeah, militias too. On the Israeli side, we have the IDF, Israeli Air Force, and possible aid from CJTF, or Combined Joint Task Force, over in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, but without the help of the United States, right? All right, Medici continued, talking about time. So pretty much the time factor in this is that Israel's going to have to hold the Golan Heights long enough for a UN declaration of peace or a call for peace made by the UN, or they're going to have to hold territory long enough in Syria to have that same goal happen, right? Civilian considerations. In keeping with tradition, we cannot afford to wage a prolonged war. From the Israeli perspective, our forces are largely comprised of citizen soldiers, so our army cannot sustain a prolonged conflict for very long, otherwise our economy will collapse, right? So, moving on. So, political, economic, social, military, information, infrastructure considerations. An unprovoked Iranian-led conflict in Israel with Russia in the wings will associate Iran with Russia, an international pariah, following the disastrous campaign in Ukraine. With Iran internationally condemned following military action in Israel, military association with Russia, and further development of nuclear weapons, international military and economic sanctions would soon ensue against Iran, and even more so with Russia, considering the Ukraine crisis, and that's going to help Israel in the long run. Also, we're going to see global oil prices surge even higher, right? Considering Iran is also a big producer of oil. Consider the Straits of Hormuz could be shut down too, right? Also, hasten nuclear procurement on behalf of Iran. They just tested a ICBM or satellite carrier today, so it's June 27th, 2022. All right, we're moving on. Geographic air and cyber elements. So the Golan Heights and Western Syria would likely be the main point of action for conflict between Israel and Iran, as stated before. What's really important about this area is the presence of the Lake Kinetri Basin, wherein 30% of Israeli water supplies originate. Additionally, continued Israeli control of the Golan Heights adds security to their eastern flank, considering its imposing view of Syria and, by association, potential Iranian ground forces. A land engagement between Israel and Iran is unlikely to venture deep into Syria, or for that matter, beyond Syria into Iraq, and probably not Iran. It's a bridge too far. Concerning the cyber domain, Iranian cyber power is relatively primitive and hardly a threat to the likes of Israel, though it is developing. Their greatest cyber threat lies in the firewall that protects their own people from Western ideas found on the internet. So they have a big censorship campaign going on. Alternatively, Israel maintains notoriously successful cyber force. Right. Moving on to the air domain, air power favors the Israeli hand. Most Israeli aircraft are of Western origin, the most recent of which, or the highest tech aircraft include the AH-64 attack helicopter. It's an Apache, American-made, and the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, also American-made. In the picture here, we got some F-15s. They're actually pretty old. Iran retains a large stock of jet fighters and some helicopters, many of which are also of Western origin. They're nearly half a century old, so they've got great equipment. It's just super old American equipment. We're looking at aircraft like the F-14, CH-47, CH-53 for lift helicopters, and then for their fighters, they mostly lean Western or Eastern Bloc. So think MiG-21s, maybe a couple MiG-29s. That's about it. What else? So they don't really have any aerial refueling capabilities like Israel does. So that's going to hurt them in the long run, considering it's a pretty long trek between Iran and Israel. Now, Israel does have that aerial refueling capability, so that is going to give them the edge in bombing strategic facilities operated by the Iranians, right? Now, when we bring Russia into the mix, we do see more high-tech fighters and more high-tech aircraft. Namely, we're talking about the Su-35 and the Su-57. It's the fifth-generation stealth fighter. So that's going to be kind of a concern. Also, to Iran's advantage, they have a large supply of Scud-like missiles, or intermediate-range ballistic missiles, which can be tipped with chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear warheads. So Israel's going to have to watch out for that, but I'm sure with their Iron Dome system, they'll be able to knock them down easy. All right, talking about sea power. Sea power is hardly something to consider in this conflict, just because both countries are kind of, they've got their own straits, and Israel has some territory on the Mediterranean, quite a lot of it, but they don't do much with that. Now, Iran has, I think it's double the submarines as Israel, so that's kind of thing. They might do better in that aspect, but you think both navies are what they call brown water navies, so shallow water navies, as opposed to a blue water navy. Lots of patrol boats, a couple submarines, a couple helicopters. Really, not that much to speak of in the naval aspect. Guns and technological elements. Looking at Israel, they have nuclear capabilities. Although it's not official, they kind of keep that under wraps, keep people guessing. Iran is developing nuclear capabilities right now, and they obviously have delivery systems. We look at Israel; they got a first-rate cyber force. They have advanced fighter aircraft as opposed to Iran, minus Russian intervention. Israel also has ballistic missile interceptor capabilities, while Iran has a large arsenal of advanced medium-range missiles and potentially large arsenal of chemical weapons. Right. So, move on to the next slide. All right, intelligence sources. So the two main intelligence agencies. So each country has their respective intelligence agency. Now, obviously, as pictured here, we get the two logos. For Iran, it's the Ministry of Intelligence, and for Israel, it is Mossad. And in the cyber domain, Israel maintains a first-rate cyber intelligence force fostered by private startups, raw natural talent, and is on the same level as China, Russia, and UK. Right. So first-rate cyber force, they're great when it comes to human intelligence capabilities. maintain an excellent human intelligence collection program, part of Mossad. Um, Organizational intelligence, Mossad acts similar to the CIA, and their core mission is progressive protection of Israeli interests. So progressive and proactive, right? Looking at the Ministry of Intelligence, kind of developing, lackluster though improving cyber intelligence system, mostly focus inwards to so as to stymie political discourse among their populace. Uh, Organizational intelligence focuses on again suppression of discourse within their own country. All right, cultural analysis really comes down to one major fight, or two major fights. It's the East versus West, order versus democracy, Islam versus Judaism, or democracy versus theocracy. So the cultures between these two countries are vastly different. Israel, Judeo-Christian, Western democratic values are represented, whereas in Iran we see something resembling a Far Eastern absolutist theocracy steeped in Islam. These are two polar opposites. It is the fight between democracy and despotism, liberty and tyranny, East versus West, so on and such forth. In a fight between the two, Israeli will have the advantage considering this theoretical conflict is an existential fight on behalf of the Israelites. All right, outcome. So I suspect the outcome of conflict of this variety would lend itself to the success of an Israeli preliminary attack in Syria, where I suspect Syrian and Iranian forces would be built up. Also, a medium-range air war would likely ensue. Israelis and Iranians alike would try to hit key strategic targets, but Israel is going to try to down the Iranian Air Force as soon as they can, kind of like they did in the 6 Days War and the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. You're going to try to strike airfields real fast and other strategic objectives. Israel would likely gain air superiority very early on in the conflict and will continue to harass Iranian and Syrian ground forces while keeping the sky clear of Iranian and Russian fighters and Scud-like missiles. Israel would likely be able to succeed in holding out until either UN pieces together calls for a ceasefire or until CJTF, my Joint Task Force on the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, decides to join the conflict. Right, so that kind of goes in with NATO. And that's my bibliography. Thanks for watching, guys. Appreciate it. Good night.